I think one of the things that businesses sometimes miss out on is that we want the best reviews. We want 5-star reviews. We want people saying this is the best thing since sliced bread. We just want people to say wonderful, glowing things about us. And we worry if the review isn't 5 stars. We worry if they bring up something potentially negative. But the truth of the matter is, those are the kinds of reviews that can actually be.
Hey everyone, my name is Scott Brandley, and I'm here with my co-host DJ Sprague and our special guest today, Nancy Harhut. Nancy, how are you today?
I'm really well. Thank you so much for having me.
We're super excited to have you. I'm personally like a kid on Christmas morning right now. Huge fan of your work. Obviously, your amazing book, which we'll talk about. But let me properly introduce you. So Nancy helps marketers unlock automatic, hardwired yes answers from their customers and prospects. Her specialty is blending best-of-breed creative with behavioral science to prompt a response. She's been named a top 100 creative influencer, a social top 50 email marketing leader, a top 40 digital strategist, and one of the top 10 most fascinating people in B2B marketing. She's presented on stage in London, Sydney, Moscow, Madrid, Stockholm, Sao Paulo, Berlin, and of course, all over the US. Prior to co-founding HBT Marketing in Boston, Nancy held senior creative positions with IPG and Publicis Networks. She and her teams have won over 200 marketing effectiveness awards, and she has recently published an award-winning book, Using Behavioral Science in Marketing. And this is one of my new go-to resources. And we're super excited to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Again, I'm really happy to be here. And that was a lovely introduction. I appreciate that.
Well, you deserve it. Your background and everything you've done in marketing and advertising and behavioral science and now authoring and, of course, being a global speaker. We really are honored to have you. And we're excited to delve into some of your thoughts and processes, and of course, your book and why you wrote that and who that's for.
Yeah. So before the show started, we were kind of geeking out together a little bit about Robert Cialdini and some of the other behavioral scientists in the market, right? So my first question to you would be, how did you get interested in behavioral science and advertising in general?
So it's kind of a two-part question. I'll give you a short but two-part answer. I was at Boston University studying journalism because I knew that I wanted to write, and I assumed that there were two courses I could take, two career paths I could take. I could be a journalist, or I could be a novelist. And I didn't think I would be a novelist, so I thought the only option was journalism. Fast forward, I'm going into my senior year, and I realized I'll be a good journalist. I won't be a great journalist. Like, I looked around, I saw some of my classmates, and they had the fire in their belly about this that I just didn't have. So I scrambled, and I took anything else I could think of that was writing related, because now I was at the university. I saw there were other options. There was corporate communications, public relations, advertising, and graduated and found my way into advertising. It just worked for me. I found a job at a small agency, which then led to bigger and bigger ones. And then eventually, as I was, working in one of these agencies, somebody recommended Robert Cialdini's book to me, Influence: The Psychology of Persuasion. And that is what opened my eyes to behavioral science and, just that the whole discipline. And I went down the rabbit hole. I was reading it, and like so many people, they say, underlining and making margin notes and putting, sticky notes in. I just, I was like, oh my gosh, this could apply to this particular client challenge I'm working on, or that might work for this client challenge I'm working on. So I started to slowly test these things. And when I realized that they were actually working, it was like, wow, there's no going back now. So that was how I got into advertising and marketing, and also how I, really got into behavioral science.
So fun.
Fantastic. It is addicting, isn't it? Once you start cracking that code and realizing, wow, there's really something here. And you see yourself actually being persuaded, ethically persuaded, as Dr. Cialdini would say, and the decisions you've made and the paths you've taken. And you realize, wow, that was really a result of a behavioral design influence, if you will, that prompted me or guided me or facilitated making that decision. And then you realize this is a science. This is not just accidental.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things about it is you read some of these principles and some of these case studies, and as a marketer, sometimes you go, oh, That's why that works. Like I either tested my way into it or I intuitively thought that it would work. And now I have the proof, that I can point to that explains why it works. And then other times, you read something, you're like, oh my gosh, it never even occurred to me to try that. That almost feels counterintuitive, but let me give it a shot. And then when, of course, it does work, you're like, awesome. One more tactic that I have that I can use to influence, the likelihood that people will do it, what I'm hoping they will. So yeah, it's pretty amazing stuff. It really is.
Scientific nudges. Well, if you would, for our audience, define behavioral science in your words so that everybody that is listening that may not be as familiar with behavioral design or behavioral science or behavioral economics can understand conceptually what it is that your book is about and what it is that we're talking about here today.
Sure. I mean, that's a good question, actually, because sometimes people hear science and, their eyes start to roll back in their heads like, oh my gosh, I don't know, test tubes, white lab coats. Like, this isn't for me. I'm a simple marketer. I like words or pictures or, but the truth is behavioral science is very simply the study of how people behave, or more specifically, why we do what we do. And behavioral scientists have found that very often people rely on decision-making shortcuts. We're hardwired to default to these automatic, instinctive, reflexive behaviors simply because we couldn't possibly take the time to weigh every bit of information before making a decision, or we'd never get around to making any decisions. So over the ages, humans have developed certain hardwired behaviors, certain default behaviors, and we cruise along through life on autopilot very often, not always, but very often. And, we encounter a certain situation and we default to these hardwired behaviors, giving them little, if any, thought. So from a marketing and advertising perspective, that really presents an opportunity for us, because if we know that people are more likely to do X if they encounter Y, well, let's make sure they encounter Y because we want them to do X. So, there's obviously, as your listeners know, and as you know, there's no magic wand, there's no silver bullet. We can't make people do something they don't want to make, but we can influence behaviors. If you think about it, we put something out in the marketplace, there's maybe, I don't know, 3 sections to our target. There's the people who are going to say, oh my gosh, Scott, DJ, this is exactly what I was looking for. Sign me up now. And then there's going to be another group of people that says, no way, no how, that's just not for me. Or even if it were, I have a preferred provider and that's the only one that I would use. And then there's this middle section of people when you think about it. And they could go either way, right? Like we have a product or service that could really benefit them. They're in our target market where, we've carefully targeted them. So we know it could be good for them. And then it really just depends on, did they see our message? Did they engage with it? Did they understand it? Did they remember it? Did they feel compelled to respond to it? And anything that we can do to increase the likelihood of those steps happening is going to make it more likely that both they and we can benefit, because they'll have found a product or a service that's good for them and will have made the sale. So that's basically how I would define behavioral science.
That makes sense. Sorry, there's another part of that question. So I'm sure you've heard that marketing's job really is to influence or change hearts and minds. That's really what marketing is supposed to do, which is why PR and advertising typically report to marketing, because marketing creates the strategy, the concepts, the brand positioning, the brand story, the brand persona, and then that then gets pushed out through advertising and PR and ultimately sales. So do you see a connection then between the concept that marketing's primary role is to change or influence hearts and minds and behavioral science?
I definitely see a link, and I'm going to put a little context into my answer, though. I grew up in advertising agencies, but primarily in direct marketing, relationship marketing, CRM, performance marketing, call it what you will. It's had many, many, many different, names, but one-to-one marketing. So I've always kind of drawn the line at, there's general brand advertising that influences your attitude and awareness. And then there's more of a direct marketing, which influences your decisions in the moment, right? It's measurable. It's based on, whether or not somebody responds. These days with the explosive growth in digital marketing, it's very easy to measure what people do. Ages ago, not as easy, but, I think about, influencing people's attitudes and awareness is one layer. And then another layer is influencing their behavior. And I really specialize in influencing their behavior. And I think the link between that and behavioral science is huge, because if what we're trying to get someone to do is not just notice the message and remember it and be aware of it, but also to act on it. We have so many tools at our disposal to do all of those things. We have behavioral science tools that will make our messages more likely to be remembered, more likely to resonate, more likely to be noticed, but also more likely to get people to act on them sooner versus later. And, that's what the name of the game is these days. We don't just want response. We want to get the response as quickly as possible because that helps us monetize our offers and continue to build out our businesses. And knowing how to prompt people's actions, their behaviors, their decisions is definitely linked, I think, to marketing, to increasing those numbers that we're looking for and increasing our ROI.
Right. Exactly. I know you're a fan of this gentleman, Gerald Zaltman.
Yes.
What customers think. You're one of the few people I know that's even heard of him. And I know you quoted him in your book using analogies and mental shortcuts, heuristics to make decisions, which is, of course, is also part of that process.
Yeah. Zaltman says up to 95% of purchase decision making takes place in the subconscious mind, which is mind blowing when you think about it. I think we, and by extension our customers and prospects, we all like to think that we make good, well thought out decisions, right? I like to think that all my decisions are well thought out, that they're all really good. And by extension, I think that my customers and prospects do the same thing. But it turns out that very often we're not making these well thought out, well considered decisions. In fact, up to 95% of the time, we're cruising along on autopilot. We're responding instinctively or reflexively. And it's amazing, but it also presents a real opportunity for us as advertisers and marketers to help guide the desired behavior, to help people help themselves, if you will.
Right. Yeah. Daniel Kahneman calls that system one thinking, I believe.
Yes.
Right.
He's got the system 1 and system 2, and the system 1 is much more reflexive, and the system 2 is much more deliberate. And very often, system 1 is what's running the show, and we really have to, struggle to get system 2 in there and take a breath and really put on our thinking caps and weigh the pros and cons and make the list and do the cost benefit analysis. And it's not that we never do. We absolutely sometimes do, but our first impulse is very often just that, an impulse, really. It's just an automatic response.
From the limbic system, where we store our emotions and emotionally charged words and emotionally charged memories, which then bubble up to the decision, all stored in that limbic system, which he refers to as animal brain, or system 1, versus system 2, which would be more cognitive processing. So that's also obviously what Gerald Zaltman gets into, which is his metaphors, which drive decision-making, right, based on metaphors and analogies that are just snap judgments. But it's really fun. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's great. I appreciate that answer. So we can kind of set the stage for what is it that we're really referring to and talking about here.
In our world, system 1, or that subconscious thinking, it comes down to ratings and reviews. And we talk about that in Reputation King, where over time, ratings and reviews have become just an impulse. Right? It's just a way to make a really fast decision online, and it's highly influential. So that's kind of fun, ties that in, right?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, congratulations on your book. It's phenomenal. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. People are cruising through life. We have to make decisions quickly. We don't want to make the wrong decision, right? We're always worried about making the wrong decision. And if you see ratings and reviews, if you see the stars, if you see the testimonials, what happens? You feel safer making a decision. You feel more comfortable making a decision. You feel like chances are you're not going to make the wrong decision. And that's what everyone is looking for. They're looking to avoid mistakes and missteps and missed opportunities. And, seeing those elements of social proof, seeing that other people like you have been happy when they've made this decision, makes the rest of us feel comfortable to make it, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
So speaking of decisions, you said something earlier that I want to kind of dig down a little bit deeper on. You talked about how when you first started seeing behavioral science happen, right? Starts doing experimentation and seeing results, that kind of changed, the direction you wanted to go in your career. Do you remember one of the first tests or experiments that you did and the impact that it had on you? Can you maybe share some of that?
Yeah, I do actually. I've been testing it here, testing it there. And I recently had gotten hired at a new agency and everything was great. I get hired and then they mentioned to me that one of their biggest pieces of business was, a little bit in jeopardy. And so they were really hoping that, my presence and the work that we're going to do would start to turn things around. Maybe the kind of thing you'd want to find out prior to accepting the job, but whatever. Okay. Got the job. I see that, what's going on. Anyway, so long story short, it was a company that sold insurance to dental professionals. And the thing is, if you can get anybody to buy insurance once, good on you, because we don't like to buy insurance. We don't like to think about the fact that we're going to die or that we're going to get disabled. And so we just keep kicking the can down the road. We think we'll do it later. We just don't want to engage. We don't want to think about it. If you can get someone to do it once, they have checked it off the list and they have zero desire to revisit it. But it turns out that you really should. You should revisit it because things change, right? Maybe your business grows, or maybe your family grows, or, you have additional financial responsibilities. And it turns out that you should, in fact, increase your life insurance, right? But, again, once somebody makes the decision once, they're like, oh, I don't even need to pay attention to this anymore because I've already checked it off my list. So they would, be sending these messages with all the great reasons why you should reevaluate your insurance, take a look, make sure you have enough. And, they're having marginal success, but nothing great. So I had read something in Cialdini's book about what he referred to as the magnetic middle. And it was this idea that for the most part, people don't like to be out on the bleeding edge, nor do they like to be lagging behind. We feel very comfortable in the middle, right? There's safety in numbers, right? We feel comfortable. We're just talking about social proof. Like if everyone else is doing it, we feel it's probably a safe thing for me to do, right? There's just a certain amount of comfort in the middle, as opposed to on either of the edges. And so I thought, I wonder if we can do something with that for this insurance. So we sent people a message and we included a graph in the message. And the graph had at the one end, $0 of insurance, the least anyone could have. And at the other end, 3 million, which was the most they were selling at this time. And then we showed people where they were, but we made sure that we always chose people who had less than half. Right? So less than 1.5 million. So even if you didn't read a word, you kind of look at the chart and at a glance, you feel like, ooh, I'm left of center. I'm lagging behind. I'm not, and we didn't expect that was going to make people right away increase the amount of money, increase the amount of insurance they had up, to the most they possibly could get. But we did think that it might move them closer to the middle. And that's exactly what happened. So this was a direct mail piece, actually. We were selling off the page. Right? It was direct sales. There was no call an agent or lead gen or anything like that. It was like, just fill out the form, send in your check. We're going to increase your coverage. We had a 459% increase over the control. And that is, that's hard sales, right? And so when I saw that, it was like, okay, like we are onto something here. There's like I said, no looking back at this point. It was
magnetic middle. Love it.
The magnetic middle. Read about it. And that's
to show what everybody else is doing, or what the average is, and that they're actually lagging behind, and they want to catch up to the middle and be part of that herd, right? It's the bandwagon effect. I want to be part of what everybody else is doing, or at least not be embarrassingly behind.
Yeah,
right?
you feel like I'm lagging behind. It just doesn't feel right. I should get closer. And that's exactly what happened. They all moved closer to the center. There's that idea of safety in numbers. That idea that social proof. If everyone's got this amount, maybe that's what I should have, because after all, we're all in the same profession. So it was a really interesting test that just paid big dividends for the client, and just cemented my belief that this is the way to go, that adding behavioral science to marketing best practices delivers that 1-2 punch that, you're just not going to get with either one of them alone. You can only go so far with the marketing best practices. When you start to overlay the decision science, how people really make decisions, and put some of those prompts or nudges in, with the right phrases or words or frames, it just increases the likelihood that, you'll land your message and you'll get the response you're looking for.
Yeah, that's cool. In my mind, I see like a herd of like elk or something, and they're like going along, and then there's one out here. He's like, I want to be with the pack, right?
Yeah. Well, and if he's not, or she's not, whatever that elk is, with the pack, that elk is more likely to get picked off by a predator, right?
Yeah.
So there really is safety in numbers. And I think it's something that's hardwired into us probably from the early ages of humankind.
That's fascinating. Just to get to the middle, like, because in your mind, you think you want to sell like, hey, be the best, or, go to the top, but you're like, no, just go for the middle. Like, just being average and go from lower average to middle average, and you're a winner, right?
Yeah.
I,
Yeah. No, and then
that's
if you think
fascinating.
about it, Scott, what we didn't do this, but what we could have then done is we could have taken another data set and taken the people who are at like 1.5 and created a chart that showed 1.5 to 3, and that might have in turn moved, but we didn't try that. But it's an interesting application when you think about it. It's like, okay, you and a bunch of people are here, but did you realize you could be all the way up here? And you might look at that and go, oh, maybe I should buy even more. But yeah, you're right. Sometimes people want the absolute best. They want to, be part of, the group of people that has the most coverage or the most expensive vehicle, or they want to have the best, the most, and that's fine. But not everyone feels that way. And clearly this group who had been, less than 1.5 on a scale of 0 to 3 didn't feel that way. So just getting them to the 1.5 was a huge win.
Yeah.
Love it.
It's so true. Quite interesting how we think we're so logical, but in fact, we're really making these decisions based on that magnetic middle. And as that middle moves, we move with it. If it moves up, we move up. Well, there's another saying in marketing that people make decisions based on emotion and justified on logic.
No, that's absolutely right. They're making decisions for the emotional reasons, and they're pointing to those, rational reasons and that's why it's so important for us as marketers to remember to have both, and this is true, I believe, across the board. Even if your product is basic or boring, or even if you're dealing with a B2B audience. We did some work for a company that was selling business intelligence software, big ticket, and had really good practical benefit. What it would do is it would unlock the data that was locked in different databases so that you'd have a full 360 view. And, until you had a product like this, you were forced to make decisions knowing that you didn't have access to all of the data that was out there. So if you think about that, what does that mean? It means that at some point you might make the wrong call because there was some little piece of data that was locked away that you didn't have access to. And it would have been the information that would have tipped the scale. But without it, you made a decision that went one way, and it turns out maybe not the best decision. So when this company came out with this product, this business intelligence software, you could see how a straight problem solution approach would have been great. It's like, here's the problem. You don't have all the information. Here's the solution. Now you can get it. Bing, bang, boom, But instead, they went with a much more emotional, more empathetic approach. They thought about what it would be like to be the executive who's making these calls, making these decisions, knowing they don't always have all the information. And how that's the kind of thing that could maybe give you, an upset stomach or keep you awake at night, or have you second guessing. And so they rolled out these ads and they had headlines like the antacid for a diet of tough decisions, or the delete button for that voice in your head. So they caught you with a very emotional, very empathetic message. And then, of course, in the body copy, they explained, what they did and why it was good for you and why you should find out more. They got a 13% increase in purchase intent based on this, because they were testing it against some of the more straightforward, problem solution. Just, hey, look, tell me what it is you have to tell me. We're a B2B audience. We don't need fluffy emotional stuff. Just give us the facts. And they got a double-digit increase in purchase intent based on it. And I think the reason was, as you're, as a member of the target, encountering this message, you think, gee, if they really understand what it's like to walk in my shoes, they know my world, they know what I'm going through, maybe they do have something that I can benefit from. So I think that emotional connection is so key. It's not all emotion, but it shouldn't all be rational either. It's having that nice balance so that you can hook people and then, follow up with the stuff they can point to that makes them feel good about their initial response, which was, yes, I want these people.
Yeah, so true. It's a great book, Mapping the Mind, Rita Carter. That's a must read. But they talk about how emotions are the conduit or the catalyst that emotionally charge information, facts, data, and stories to be remembered. And they create multiple neurons firing because of the emotional impact, whereas data has very limited neuron firing, very limited neuron impact. But emotions, and of course, storytelling, right? You talk about storytelling in your book, and storytelling is critical because that's the analogies and the emotions that get deeply embedded in the limbic system for the long-term memory, and then the system one recall and decision-making. So data is not exciting. It's not emotional. It's not usually that memorable. But when you can combine that with a story or a metaphor or an analogy or emotion, then it gets embedded in the limbic system and it stays there potentially for eternity.
Yeah, no, it's amazing the power of storytelling. I think if you're just dealing with like facts and figures, just the basic data, I think I read that it activates the two areas of the brain, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are the two areas that are responsible for processing language, I think it is. But once you start with stories and, maybe you talk about, waking up this morning with the smell of hazelnut coffee wafting under your door jam, or maybe you talk about, going out for a run, but tripping and slamming into the pavement and smashing your nose. As you start to bring in these other areas of the brain, the olfactory cortex in the case of the smell, or the motor cortex in the case of running and then smashing into the sidewalk, it activates those areas of the brain. And the net apparently is the more areas of the brain that are activated, the better you understand the information. And DJ, to your point, the longer you remember it. So you embed these stories in people's brains, and what you've managed to do is it's almost like marketing gold. You're able to take what you have in your brain and plant it into someone else's brain. Like what how else can you do that? That's amazing. But you get the right story, and it does lodge in someone's brain. They understand the information, way more likely to remember it. Stories have emotions. Stories focus on how you experience things, and for a variety of reasons, stories can be incredibly effective for us as marketers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's how we translated information forever before the written word. It was all stories, right? Everything was a story, and you were a master storyteller, especially if you're the leader of the tribe or the family or the village, whatever it was. Your job was to remember and tell those stories so that people had context. People had a sense of belonging, a sense of tribalism, a sense of mission, a sense of value. And it was all translated through verbal stories.
Yep. No, that's absolutely true. Way before the written word, people relied on stories, and they're engaging, they're involving, how information was transferred. And it's interesting. There was a group of journalists who became researchers, and they started something called the Significant Objects Project. And what they did is they proved that stories can actually add value to a product. So what they did is, and maybe you've heard this, but they went out to tag sales, flea markets. They bought up stuff people didn't want, and then they had writers write a story, a short story about each of these particular objects, and they put them on eBay for sale. And the stories were stories, right? It was absolutely clear that they were stories. They weren't meant to be the truth, but they were kind of interesting stories. And they got a tremendous ROI. For example, they bought this Utah snow globe, one of those little globes that you can shake and you can see the snow. This Utah snow globe, they bought it for 99 cents at a tag sale. They sold it on eBay with the story for $59, which is
Oh, wow.
And what the researchers found was stories can add value. So, sometimes we think, oh, it's, stories are fluffy. We don't really need them, but they can not only, as we said, make the message more memorable, make it more understandable, but they can also hit your bottom line because they can add value to the product or the service.
They convey meaning. They convey emotion, context, history, belonging. Maybe it's even hopes, dreams, and desires. Maybe it's, the desire to collect, or the desire to have something exclusive or rare or unique or handmade. Those are all important words that are emotionally charged because people want something unique, something that has a story behind it. Right? Going back to your book where you talk about products that are, handmade and rare and unique, people value those more than mass-produced items because they have no story. It's like everything else that came off the assembly line. But when you buy something from an artisan that's handmade, and there's a story behind the artisan, there's a story behind the making of the product, the ingredients, the raw materials, the craftsmanship. Wow, now you have something. And when somebody's at your house, they say, oh, that's a cool thing. Well, let me tell you a story about that. Right?
Yeah.
And now you've got a conversation piece. That's what a conversation piece is. It has a story behind it.
No, you're absolutely right. And being the one that can share that story, being the one that owns that story now, makes you feel special, right? You feel exclusive. You feel like you've got something that no one else has, or not a lot of other people have. And, and you I think you take more joy out of the product because of that backstory, because the story behind it, and it is something special, and it's yours. And now, you've got a story to tell. It's really powerful stuff. So I always say to my clients, when you're going to use storytelling, make sure that the stories, don't take this as license to go on and on and on about your company or your product, right? Make sure the story is about your customer. Like make the customer the hero of the story so that your prospect can put themselves in the customer's shoes and they can start to experience the same things that, the customer in your story is experiencing. Maybe that pride, maybe that sense of accomplishment, maybe that feeling of relief, whatever it happens to be, make sure that your customer is the hero of the story. And, people will come to their own conclusion that it's a result of your product or your service or your company. But, when we talk about the value of storytelling, it's not licensed to just go on and on and on about, we, our company, it's like nobody wants to hear that. But if you can focus on a customer story, and that customer is like me, speaking of social proof, right? The closer they are to me, the more likely I am to be influenced by them. Then you've got a winning story.